So let me shift now to talking about education then and now. And I think from at least my perspective, what I'll be sharing with you could be applied to Canada and probably the US to some extent, but certainly other countries as well. When I look back in Australia's education, actually there are aspects of it that haven't really changed much. Australia has always had public education, and that still continues today. But it's been supplemented by church education, particularly the Catholic Church. And that again still continues to today. And the Catholic Church would argue that if they didn't provide it, who would? And that's oftentimes an argument for them getting government funding. And then you have, like in the US and like in Canada, but probably more so in Australia, a private school sector. Interestingly, in Australia, the government funds all three sectors, which leads to a lot of major issues, particularly in the public sector, where public kids are getting sometimes only 50% of the funding the kids in the private sector are getting. And that's a major bone of contention. And I think Australia is one of the very few countries in the world where the government actually funds private and church education. I think in Belgium is one of them, for example. But that really raises very, very interesting issues. When you look at the curriculum, one of the things that the wonderful British Empire did, which is now the Commonwealth of Nations, by the way, and I think it's, I forget how many countries make up the British Commonwealth of Nations. I think it's as many as 53. But one of the things they amazingly did is they had a huge influence on the curriculum. And so the curriculum, for all intents and purposes, was a British curriculum. So if you want to check that out, I'm sure you could come up with a little test of famous British characters. When I was growing up, we learnt about British heroes. We read British novels and British plays. From Shakespeare to Bronte and so on. To some extent, that curriculum has been added to with flourishes of, interestingly, Asian history and Australia's own history, particularly Indigenous history. But what you've got going on with the curriculum, it's still very oriented toward a very British academic style, except in the beginning grades, when it's the beginning grades in Australia, I think are probably some of the best teaching and learnings occurring. It's so influenced by so many perspectives and histories attend, early childhood education and so on. But the curriculum has stayed to be fairly academic with these high stakes tests, particularly coming out of high school. When I went through school, there were three strands basically, a strand of kids, a small percentage of kids, I'd say about 10% of the school, who might go on to higher education of some type. A group that might go into trades and typically left high school at the age of 15. And then another group that would get into general work. To some extent, that's remained. My experience growing up in Australia, I seem to always sort of scrape through, but oftentimes my classmates didn't and would either leave high school or repeat the grade to go on. When I got to university, there was just a very small percentage. I think I started off with a high school class of about 500, and probably of that, certainly less than 10% would have gone on to university. And at university, when I went to university, the ratio of men to women was 8-1. That shifted. More kids are going into higher education. The proportion of women going in is much higher. But in Australia, it feels a little bit like the state of Colorado for those folks from the States, where you don't necessarily need a university degree to earn a good living. And indeed, I think Australia, in terms of salaries and that, is considered about, I think, the 5th in the world among the highest. And but a large proportion of Australians now are going into university. Unfortunately, the groups that dominated, kids who've gone to the private schools, and indeed at the University of Sydney where I worked, the law school, which is the faculty from which most of Australia's prime ministers have been drawn, I think it's something like 70 or 80% of the students going to the law school are from private high schools. It is a country where education still perpetuates the social reproduction of privilege, a privilege tied to class and those who can afford a better education than others. And so oftentimes in the universities you sort of see, I think, a disproportion of kids from higher economic families with more income. And still in Australia, very few Indigenous students. Indeed, the first Indigenous students to graduate from a university occurred in my lifetime in Australia, and still the proportion is quite low